The celebratory day in New Orleans takes a turn for the worse when an explosive goes off aboard a ferry carrying U.S. Navy officials and their families. While a few jump into the river to save themselves, the explosion brutally ends the lives of 543 of the ferry's passengers. Shortly after arriving on the scene, ATF Special Agent Doug Carlin comes across burnt pieces of plastic and connecting wires on the riverbank, compelling him to request for all the surveillance footage from around the area. Coupled with his hunch, further investigation leads him below the adjacent Crescent City Bridge, which is where FBI agent Paul Prizewara finds him a while later. With Paul's help, Doug is able to conclude that the substance used in the explosive was possibly ANFO, which is water-soluble ammonium nitrate. Armed with evidence that the explosion couldn't have been an accident, Doug reports his findings before heading to his workplace. Joining his colleague Donnelly, he then looks through the surveillance footage he had requested earlier. Trying to reach out to his partner, ATF Special Agent Larry Minotti, he leaves him a message to get to work to help with the case. He then also calls back an anonymous lead that had left him a message but gets their answering machine instead. While leaving a message on this call, Doug spots a man on the bridge just before the explosion. Elsewhere, as the in charge of the investigation, Special Agent Jack McCready speaks to the press and informs them about the explosion being a deliberate act of terror. Meanwhile, Doug receives intriguing information about a body found in the river shortly before the explosion. Deciding to partake in the examination of this corpse of Claire Kuchever, Doug discovers duct tape residue across her mouth in addition to an absent earring before Donnelly informs him about a missing report in her name. He then heads over to meet Claire's father, whom she was originally supposed to pick up from the airport that morning. From him, he learns about her ex-fiancé Alan and also requests for the keys to Claire's house. Going through her apartment and hearing his own voice on her answering machine, Doug realizes that she was the one who had left a message for him at the office earlier, and the one whom he had called back after the explosion. He then meets Agent McCready to report his findings about Claire and mentions that there were heavy fuel burns on her body, in addition to traces of PETN, which is the base explosive used by domestic terrorists. He also adds that her severed fingers were possibly supposed to look like the impact of the blast, but that the autopsy places her time of passing roughly 2 hours before the explosion instead. Giving his opinion then, he says that she could have been abducted and tortured before being thrown in the river to make it look like she is just one among the several blast victims. Stating PETN as the connection between both cases, Doug also mentions that Claire's missing van could have been the one used in the explosion before adding the vital tidbit that she had called the ATF office in the morning. Taking his leave then, Doug suddenly notices Larry's car there and is informed that it is among the cars that belonged to the victims of the blast. Speaking to Paul later, Doug is offered to join a new investigative unit whose first case was going to be the ferry blast. Thinking it through, he wholeheartedly agrees to join the team to find Larry's culprit. Accompanying Paul then, Doug finds that the team is led by Dr. Alexander Denny. Surprisingly, he also finds that the team works on a surveillance digital recreation program named Snow White, which apparently works on primary data from satellite images. The issues they seem to be facing are that they can watch footage from 4 days and 6 hours ago, since it takes exactly that amount of time for digital recreation, and that they can watch it only once without going back again to confirm details. When asked his opinion about where in the dock or the ferry they should look to find a clue, Doug suggests checking Claire's house instead. Observing the surveillance from her apartment, Doug comes to know that desperation for money had led to Alan contacting her 4.5 days ago, urging her to sell the van and give him half the proceeds. In addition to confirming that she did indeed have a date like her father had informed Doug, certain incidents also compel him to doubt that she can sense their presence. Though Paul assures him that the connection is strictly one way, Alexander avoids providing any such assurance. At Claire's funeral the next day, Doug notices Alan's absence but soon realizes the possibility of the bomber having attended instead. Going through surveillance again later, the team witnesses Claire receiving a call inquiring about her van's sale. Doug's intuition leads him to realize that the caller is indeed the bomber they are looking for, and requests for the call to be recorded so they can run a voice analysis. Unfortunately though, tracking the number reveals that he called from a phone booth outside the target area of Snow White. Armed with the voice of the bomber, the team then accesses general surveillance footage from an ATM across from the phone booth, only to see the caller's back. Using facial recognition software on his bag though, Doug is able to match it to its owner on the footage of the ferry's dock 2 nights before the explosion. This also leads to the conclusion that they will be able to use Snow White in 7 hours to see exactly who the bomber is. Continuing to observe Claire, Doug decides to work on his earlier intuition. When he discreetly shines a beam of laser onto the screen, the entire system collapses as Claire shockingly notices it in her house. Forced to reveal the secrets they had been hiding till now, the team then explains to Doug that Snow White is a way to fold space back onto itself to link 2 distant points instantaneously. Alexander urges Doug to understand that while it is the actual past that they are looking back at with this technology, they stumbled upon it by accident. That is why, he says, everyone is scared of messing with it, as they do not know the potential consequences. Figuring out that all of this basically means that they can manipulate time, Doug convinces the team to send an anonymous tip that includes the time and location details of the suspect to his past self. Observing the surveillance from his office then, Doug realizes that he was arguing with his partner Larry 4.5 days ago. Past Doug leaves his office in a huff before the note gets through, and it is Larry who finds it instead. While Larry heads to the dock to confirm the legitimacy of the tip, the team switches to observe the dock in the hopes of finding the bomber. Eventually spotting him, the identification process is initiated, while the team also spots Larry's arrival. Much to Doug's disappointment, they also witness Larry confronting the bomber and getting shot in return. The bomber then begins traveling out of Snow White's range with an injured Larry. Determined to save his partner, Doug uses a portable goggle rig to follow the bomber and strangely manages to catch up to the past while still being in the present. Swerving through the present day's oncoming traffic, Doug allows the team to guide him through the bomber's progress. Soon enough, a crash in the present breaks the goggle rig, making it so that Doug cannot see the past anymore, but the team can still catch the signal it is remitting. Following their directions, Doug continues to pursue the bomber's course, eventually arriving at a hideout. Getting out of the vehicle, he then proceeds on foot with the goggle rig and its power source while the team continues to witness the past. While Doug can only see remains of the past in the present, the team sees the past as it unfolds and unfortunately also witnesses Larry being shot and then set on fire. While the FBI further investigates the crime scene later, Doug comes across a stray earring among the debris which he remembers was missing during Claire's autopsy. Meanwhile, the bomber is identified as Carol Ohrstedt. Once he is tracked down, he is brought in for a questioning with Doug, during which it is revealed that he was rejected from joining the military earlier on the grounds of being unstable. Doug also finds out that Carol thinks of himself as a patriot, which is why his rejection compelled him to launch an attack on the country's government. Doug eventually gets a full confession from Carol for the ferry bombing and about his methods of ending both Larry as well as Claire. He details that while he was kind to Larry by shooting him before setting him on fire, he didn't extend the same kindness to Claire since a gunshot wound would have clearly given away that she wasn't among the ferry blast victims. Satisfied with the evidence and Carol's confession, the in charge, Jack McCready, closes the investigation. However, Doug refuses to see this as a victory since they weren't really able to change anything. Paul tries reasoning with him by reminding him that they successfully caught the culprit before insisting that Claire's end is not Doug's fault. Nonetheless, Doug ends up contacting Alexander to convince him to send him back in time despite it being the first time Snow White would be used for this purpose. Since the operation is officially shut down, Doug meets a lone Alexander back at the team's office and prepares to go back in time to the morning of the ferry blast. Surprisingly, Alexander successfully sends Doug to the past, ensuring that he appears in a hospital so he can immediately be revived. Waking up a while later, Doug steals clothes from another patient before sneaking out of the hospital. He steals an ambulance then and proceeds directly to Carol's hideout where Claire is already being held captive. While Carol prepares to end her life, she fights back and manages to scratch him. Seeing that she drew his blood, which could be found under her fingernails and lead to him later, he grabs his pliers to sever her fingers. Doug gets there just then, which distracts Carol as the ambulance crashes in. Shooting at Doug, he then grabs his chance to exit the shed. When Doug crawls out of the ambulance and sees a knocked-out Claire, Carol blows the place up. Grabbing Claire just in time, Doug is able to save both of them before the worst of the explosion hits and then drags her further away to safety. He also sees Carol flee the place in Claire's van and notices that he managed to save Claire before she lost her fingers. Getting another car from the hideout, Doug then tells Claire about the impending ferry attack. Arriving at her apartment, he prepares to treat his wound and also leaves himself a message that convinces his present self to go back and save Claire's life. Noticing the dress she changes into, he requests her to pick something else so she doesn't match with the victim. Pretending to agree with him, her doubt about Doug compels her to aim her weapon at him instead. Calling the ATF then, she speaks to Donnelly to confirm Doug's identity and leaves him a message to call her back. Willing to hear his side of the story now, Claire asks him to explain everything that is going on. Calming down then, Claire helps tend to Doug's wound while he tells her that he is able to know certain things ahead of time because of a special device that belongs to the government. By the time Claire is done with his wound, he looks around the mess in the bathroom to realize that nothing has changed yet and rushes her out. Just as they are leaving, her phone rings and Doug asks her not to answer it. He then proves that he knows things before time by reciting every word of the message her friend leaves for her on the answering machine, having already heard it through Snow White. Convinced that he can save her, Claire then accompanies Doug to the ferry dock. Deciding to defuse the bomb himself instead of involving the police and risking Carol change his plan, Doug gets to the dock with Claire where she easily spots her van already parked on the ferry's car deck. Once they see Carol on his way out of the dock, Doug instructs Claire to raise the alarm about the explosive on board when the ferry leaves before boarding the ferry himself. Meanwhile, Carol is about to leave the dock when he recognizes the vehicle that Doug nicked from his hideout, to realize that his plan is in danger and rushes back to the ferry. While Doug is forced to leave the car deck since the ferry is about to leave, Carol boards the ferry at the last possible minute. Seeing him, Claire decides to jump directly onto the ferry's car deck instead of staying on the dock like Doug asked her to. Meanwhile, Doug observes the Crescent City Bridge and realizes that Carol isn't there, like he had seen him on the security footage, which compels him to get down to the car deck where Carol has unfortunately found Claire. With only about 5 minutes left for the explosion, Doug sees Carol as he opens fire on the car deck. Cautiously moving through the parked cars, Doug finds Claire bound to the steering wheel of her van. Signaling her to start the van, Doug proceeds to distract Carol with his own words spoken during his interrogation in the future. Repeating Carol's phrase about human collateral being the cost of freedom, Doug successfully confuses him, which allows Claire to ram the van into him. Additionally, Doug shoots him to his end even as the police arrive at the ferry's location. Out of time to free Claire since they are surrounded by police and are only 2 minutes away from the explosion, Doug gets her to drive into the river instead. He manages to free her just before the ferry fully submerges the car, allowing Claire to safely swim to the surface. Unable to leave the van himself though, Doug is taken out in the underwater explosion. Claire grieves her loss even as she is rescued and taken back to the dock. Amidst several relieved family reunions on the dock, Claire is surprised when she sees the arrival of the present-day Doug. Unlike their previous meeting, however, she is the one who knows everything this time, while all he has is only just a faint sense of déjà vu.